the silence in the Castillo mansion wasn't peaceful. It was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that smelled of expensive bourbon, cold marble, and unspoken grief. This was a house built on the foundation of power, but tonight that foundation was cracking. For the 14th hour in a row, the sound of the twins, Leo and Julian, tore through the soundproofed walls of the master wing. It was a raw, rhythmic agony, a primal scream that seemed to demand an answer from a mother who was no longer there to give it. Hello to all of you joining us today. Whether you're watching from the quiet, rain-slicked streets of London, the bustling heart of New York, the sun-drenched coast of Australia, or somewhere far more secluded, I am so incredibly glad you found your way here. How are you truly doing today? Is your heart at peace, or are you searching for a little bit of magic in the middle of a storm? If you've been finding comfort and escape in our stories, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. It helps us keep these narratives alive for you, and we'd love to have you as part of our growing family. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I love reading where our stories travel to. In the dim, gold-leafed shadows of the hallway, Ellen Ripley stood frozen. Her fingers were trembling so violently she had to tuck them into the pockets of her oversized starch-white apron. She was a ghost in this house. A girl hired 3 weeks ago to polish silver she wasn't allowed to use and to stay out of sight of the men in dark suits who paced the perimeter with bulges under their jackets. She was the shy one, the girl who kept her head down so low her chin practically bruised her collarbone. But the sound of those babies, it wasn't just noise. It wasn't just a nuisance to be ignored like the other staff members did, pressing their hands over their ears in the kitchen. To Ellen, it was a frequency of pain she recognized in her own marrow. It was the sound of being abandoned. Inside the nursery, a room filled with hand-carved rocking horses and silk blankets that cost more than Ellen's yearly salary, Dominic Toretto was unraveling. To the outside world, Dominic was a titan. He was a man whose name was whispered like a curse in the shipping docks and high-rise boardrooms of the city. He was the shadow that moved the markets and the fist that crushed dissent. But standing between two white cribs, he looked like a shipwrecked survivor. His massive shoulders, etched with the ink of 1,000 sins and the scars of a dozen betrayals, were hunched. He was a man who could command an army of 500 seasoned soldiers, yet he was utterly defeated by 2 7-pound infants. Every time he tried to touch them, his hands that had broken bones and signed death warrants, seemed to frighten them more. His presence was too big, too jagged. He carried the electrical storm of his own suppressed mourning into the room with him, and the babies felt it. They didn't see a father. They felt a vacuum where their mother's warmth should be. He hadn't slept in 3 days. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw covered in a thick, dark stubble that spoke of a man who had forgotten the concept of time. The grief for his late wife, who had traded her last breath for their first, was a wound that refused to scab over. These 2 tiny mirrors of her face kept the wound bleeding. "Please," Dominic growled, the word catching in a throat raw from shouting at specialists flown in from Switzerland and London. "Please just close your eyes. Just for an hour." Ellen watched through the sliver of the cracked door. She saw the way Julian's face was turning a terrifying shade of purple, his lungs straining. She saw Leo's tiny fists beating against the air, fighting a world that felt cold and empty. The guards were stationed at the end of the hall, their faces stoic masks, but their eyes were full of a twitchy, nervous pity. No one went in. No one dared to interfere with the boss's private hell. To enter that room without an invitation was to invite a wrath that few survived. But Ellen wasn't thinking about the boss. She wasn't thinking about the legendary violence associated with the Toretto name or the rumors of the blood ledger he supposedly kept. She was thinking about her own mother's voice, a memory of a lullaby that felt like the only piece of gold she owned in a world made of lead. Her feet moved before her brain could scream a warning. The floorboards, polished to a mirror finish, didn't even creak under her light frame. She pushed the door open. The scent of expensive bourbon, heavy cologne, and sour baby formula hit her like a physical wall. Dominic didn't hear her at first. He was buried in his own despair, his head in his hands, his back to the door. He looked like a fallen god in a temple of gold. Ellen reached the first crib. Her heart was a drum in her ears, thudding so hard she thought it might actually burst her ribs and spill out onto the floor. She didn't look at the giant of a man 3 feet away. She couldn't afford to. If she looked at him, she would run. Instead, she looked at Julian. With a grace that seemed to materialize out of the ether, she reached down. Her hands weren't trembling anymore. The moment she touched the child, a strange icy calm settled over her. She scooped the infant up, supporting his neck with a practiced ease he hadn't felt since the hospital. Dominic lunged to his feet, a predatory instinct flaring. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the small of his back where a weapon usually sat. He was half-dressed, water still glistening on the hard, tan ridges of his tattooed chest, his eyes wild and dangerous. "Who the hell are you?" he rasped. The voice was a low, guttural rumble, the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. It should have sent her sprinting for the exit. It should have made her drop to her knees in apology. Ellen didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was a desert. Instead, she tucked Julian into the crook of her neck, pressing his damp cheek against her skin. She reached out her other hand, snagging Leo's tiny, flailing fingers through the bars of the second crib. Then she began to hum. It wasn't a song anyone would find on the radio. It was a low, vibrating drone, a sound of pure safety that seemed to come from the earth itself. She began to sway, a slow, rhythmic movement that mimicked the heavy, comforting heartbeat of a mother in the womb. Dominic froze. The air in the room, previously thick with the static electricity of his rage, began to clear. Julian's screams turned into jagged gasps, then into soft, hitching whimpers. Within 60 seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic esh of Ellen's breath and the heavy, stunned respiration of the Mafia Boss. Leo's eyes flickered, his tiny body finally relaxing as he gripped Ellen's finger like a lifeline. For the first time in 5 months, the Castillo mansion was silent. Truly silent. Ellen's eyes finally drifted up, meeting Dominic's. Up close, he was terrifying. He was a landscape of scars and muscle, a man built for war. But she also saw the raw, jagged edges of his soul. She saw a man who was drowning in a sea of money and blood, unable to save the only two things that mattered. The embarrassment hit her then, a hot, agonizing flush rising from her chest to her cheeks. She was holding the heir to a criminal empire while their father stood there, nearly naked in his private sanctuary. She had broken the cardinal rule of the household: never be noticed. I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I heard them. I didn't think. I heard them." She began to lower Julian back into the crib, her movements becoming frantic as the reality of her intrusion set in. She needed to get out. She needed to disappear back into the laundry room before he realized she had seen him like this, broken, vulnerable human. The sun didn't rise over the Castillo estate so much as it bled into it, painting the marble floors in shades of bruised purple and weak gold. Ellen Ripley hadn't moved from the rocking chair in the corner of the nursery for 6 hours. Julian was a warm weight against her chest, his tiny breathing a rhythmic puff of air against her collarbone. Leo was tucked into the crook of her arm, his small hand still curled tightly around her thumb. Across from her, Dominic Toretto sat on the edge of his massive unmade bed in the adjoining room, the door left wide open. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night watching her. He watched the way her head occasionally nodded in exhaustion, only for her to jerk awake and tighten her hold on his sons. He watched the way she whispered to them in her sleep, fragments of a language he didn't recognize, soft and melodic. Dominic was a man who lived by a rigid code of suspicion. In his world, a stranger in your bedroom was a threat. A stranger holding your children was a death sentence. And yet, as he looked at Ellen, he felt a terrifying, unfamiliar sensation: peace. It was a fragile thing, like a glass bird in a hurricane, but it was there. "You should go to bed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that startled her. Ellen jumped, her eyes snapping open. She immediately looked down at the babies, relieved to find them still asleep. I'm fine, Mr. Toretto. I didn't want to wake them by moving." "You've been holding them for 6 hours," Dominic said, standing up. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, his bare feet silent on the silk rug. He was now wearing a silk robe loosely tied, but the power radiating off him was no less intimidating. "My back would have snapped after 2. You're stronger than you look, Ellen." He stepped closer and Ellen felt that familiar surge of panic. Up close, Dominic Toretto was an overwhelming presence. He smelled of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and something uniquely him: a metallic, sharp scent of adrenaline. But as she looked up into his eyes, she didn't see the Black King of the city's underworld. She saw a man whose deepest desire was written in the lines around his tired eyes. He wanted to be a father, but he was terrified he was only a monster. "I grew up in a house full of siblings," Ellen whispered, looking down at her lap. It was a half-truth. "I learned early that babies don't care about your back. They only care if you're still there when they reach out." Dominic leaned against the mahogany pillar of the nursery door. "Where is your family now?" The question hit Ellen like a physical blow. She thought of the small, cramped apartment 300 miles away. She thought of the debts her father had left behind, the reason she had fled to this city and taken a job under a false name, hiding her education and her past just to be a ghost in a mansion. Her deepest fear wasn't Dominic's temper. It was being found by the creditors who thought she was her father's collateral. "Gone," she said simply. "It's just me." Dominic studied her. He was an expert at reading people he had to be to survive. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the way she guarded her words as carefully as she guarded his son's. He had secrets. Everyone in this house had secrets. But hers didn't feel like a knife in the dark. They felt like a shield. "My wife, Letty." Dominic started, the name sounding like a prayer and a wound all at once. She was the one who was supposed to do this. She was the light. "I'm just the shadow she left behind to watch over them." "I don't know how to be the light, Ellen." This was the vulnerability he never showed his captains. He never admitted he was lost. But here in the blue light of dawn, with a girl who looked like she was made of porcelain and iron, the truth slipped out. "You don't have to be the light," Ellen said softly, her voice gaining a sudden, surprising strength. "You just have to be the walls. The light comes later. Right now they just need to know the walls won't fall down." Dominic stared at her, a strange, tight knot forming in his chest. He had spent his life being the walls of an empire, but no one had ever told him that was enough for his family. The door to the nursery creaked open further and a woman stepped in. This was Sarah Connor, the head of the household staff. She was a woman of 50 with a face like a flint axe and eyes that saw everything. She stopped dead when she saw Ellen in the chair and Dominic standing over her. "Sir," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to Ellen with a mix of shock and disapproval. "The shift change was an hour ago. Ellen should be in the laundry." "Ellen isn't going to the laundry," Dominic said, his voice regaining its steel. He didn't look away from Ellen. "From now on she is the primary caregiver for the boys. Move her things to the guest suite next to the nursery. She reports directly to me. No one else touches those children without her permission. Is that clear?" Sarah's jaw dropped. "But sir, she's a maid. We have no background on her other than the agency." "I don't care about the agency," Dominic snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous fire. "She did in 1 hour what 20 specialists couldn't do in 5 months. She stays." Sarah bowed her head quickly. "Of course, Mr. Toretto." As Sarah hurried out, Ellen felt a wave of vertigo. Guest suite. Primary caregiver. Direct report to the boss. This was the opposite of staying hidden. This was being placed in the center of a fortress. "Mr. Toretto, I don't know if I can," Ellen stammered. "I'm just a maid. I don't have training. I just—" "You have the only thing that matters," Dominic interrupted. He walked over and reached down, his hand hovering near her face before he caught himself and diverted it to Julian's head, stroking the baby's fine hair with a single finger. "You have their trust. And whether you like it or not, you've started to earn mine." He looked at her then, and for a split second the air between them turned electric. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a spark of something much more dangerous. A connection between two people who were both, in their own ways, hiding from a world that wanted to break them. "Get some sleep, Ellen," he said, his voice softening. "You're part of the inner circle now. That means you're safe. As long as you're within these walls, nothing can touch you. I promise you that." Ellen watched him walk away, his robe billowing behind him. He thought he was offering her safety. He didn't realize that for a girl like her, being noticed by a man like him was the most dangerous thing in the world. She looked down at the twins. They were her shield now and she was theirs. But as she moved to lay them back in their cribs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just traded one cage for another. A cage made of gold, silk, and the heavy, intoxicating presence of a man who didn't know how to let go. The transition from the basement laundry to the golden heights of the master wing felt like a fever dream. For a week, Ellen Ripley lived in a world of silk sheets and hushed whispers. Her life was measured in the rhythmic breathing of the twins and the heavy, silent footsteps of Dominic Toretto as he lingered in the doorway each night. The shy maid was gone, replaced by a woman who walked through the halls with the boss's heirs in her arms, a position that earned her the terrified respect of the guards and the jealous glares of the kitchen staff. But peace in the Toretto household was always a borrowed commodity. It happened on a Tuesday, a day when the sky was the color of a bruised plum. Dominic was in the city, attending a meeting of the families, to discuss territory disputes that had been simmering since his wife's passing. The mansion felt hollow without his presence, the air thinner. Ellen was in the private garden, a high-walled sanctuary filled with white roses. Julian and Leo were sleeping in their pram, shaded by a weeping willow. For the first time in months, Ellen felt a flicker of hope. She looked at her hands, they weren't shaking. They have her eyes, a voice said. Ellen bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing by the fountain was a man she hadn't seen before. He was lean, dressed in a suit that looked like it cost more than the mansion's security system, and he carried a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. This was Frank Costello, Dominic's oldest rival and the man who believed half of the Toretto empire belonged to him. "Who are you?" Ellen whispered, moving instinctively to stand between the man and the pram. "You shouldn't be here." "The guards." "The guards are currently preoccupied with a very expensive distraction at the front gate," Frank said, a thin, oily smile stretching across his face. He stepped closer, the tap-tap-tap of his cane echoing on the stone. "And you must be the miracle worker. The little mouse who silenced the Toretto lions." "Leave," Ellen said, her voice cracking but firm. "Yow. I'm not here for the children, child." "Not today," Frank chuckled, though the sound was devoid of humor. "I'm here to see if the rumors were true. They say Dominic has found a new weakness. A soft spot. I didn't believe it. The man is a stone. But look at you, you're trembling. And look at him." He pointed toward the glass doors of the terrace. Dominic was standing there. He had returned early, and the look on his face was enough to stop a heart. It wasn't just rage, it was a cold, calculated promise of extinction. "Frank," Dominic's voice was a low, vibrating hum of violence. "You're off your leash." "Just admiring the view, Dominic," Frank said, raising his hands in a mock gesture of peace. "You've changed the locks, but you forgot to close the window. Is this the one? The girl who calmed the storm?" In a movement so fast the eye could barely track it, Dominic was across the garden. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need to. He grabbed Frank by the throat and pinned him against the stone fountain, the water splashing over them both. "If you ever look at her again," Dominic hissed, his face inches from Frank's, "if you even breathe the same air as my sons, I will burn your world down until there isn't enough ash left to bury. Do you understand?" Frank sputtered, his face turning a dark, mottled red, but he managed a wheezing laugh. "You're already burned, Dominic. You've let a stranger into the heart of your home. You don't even know who she is." Dominic threw him aside like a piece of refuse. Two of Dominic's men, Bucky Barnes and Arthur Shelby, appeared at the gate, looking ashen-faced at their failure. "Get him out of here," Dominic commanded. "And if I see either of you before you've found the breach in my security, don't bother coming back." As the men dragged a coughing Frank away, the garden fell into a terrifying silence. The twins, startled by the noise, began to wail. Ellen moved to them, but for the first time her touch didn't work immediately. Her own terror was radiating off her, an invisible scent that the infants caught instantly. Dominic turned toward her, his chest heaving, his suit jacket ruined. He looked like the monster the world feared, a man of blood and iron. "Ellen," he said, stepping toward her. "Don't," she gasped, backing away with the pram. "He's right. You don't know who I am. You shouldn't have me here. I'm putting them in danger just by being a target." "You are not a target," Dominic roared, the sound making the twins scream harder. He immediately winced, dropping his volume, his hands twitching at his sides. "You are the only thing keeping this family from falling into the abyss." "I'm a maid, Dominic," she cried, using his name for the first time. The sound of it seemed to shock them both. "I'm a girl with a fake ID and a father who owes money to people like you. I'm not a miracle. I'm a liability." The revelation hung in the air, a jagged piece of glass between them. Ellen's secret was out, the reason she had been so shy, so hidden. She waited for him to call the guards. She waited for him to throw her out into the street where Frank's men or her father's creditors were waiting. Instead, Dominic did something she never expected. He walked to her, ignored the crying children for a split second, and took her face in his massive, scarred hands. He forced her to look up at him. "I don't care about your father," he whispered, his thumb brushing a tear away from her cheek. "I don't care about your name. You saved my sons. You brought peace to a house that hasn't seen it in years." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. It was an act of such profound intimacy and vulnerability that Ellen forgot to breathe. "Frank didn't come here to kill me," Dominic murmured. "He came here to see what I would do to protect you. And now he knows." "What?" Ellen breathed. "He knows that I would kill every man in this city to keep you safe." Before she could process the weight of that statement, the first major twist of the night dropped. Sarah Connor, the head housekeeper, came running into the garden, her face white. "Sir." "The nursery. Someone was inside while we were at the gate." Dominic and Ellen sprinted back into the house, their hearts in their throats. They burst into the guest suite where Ellen had been staying. The room had been tossed, but nothing was stolen. Except for one thing. On the pillow of Ellen's bed lay a single gold locket. Ellen's blood turned to ice. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and opened it. Inside was a picture of her as a child, held by a woman who looked exactly like Dominic's late wife, Letty. Dominic stared at the photo, then at Ellen, then back at the photo. The resemblance wasn't just a coincidence. It was a mirror. "Ellen," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, haunting whisper. "Why do you have a picture of my wife's sister? The one who was supposed to have died in the fire 20 years ago." The room seemed to tilt. Ellen looked at the man she was falling for, the man who had just promised to kill for her, and realized that this shy maid wasn't just a stranger. She was the ghost of the family he thought he had lost. The air in the master suite was no longer just thick with the scent of lilies and expensive leather. It was charged with a heavy, suffocating static. The revelation of the locket had turned the mansion into a beautiful cage. Outside, the world was a battlefield where Frank Costello's men were likely regrouping, but inside, a different kind of war was being waged. A war of shadows, memories, and a magnetic pull that neither Dominic nor Ellen could resist. If you're just joining us, you've arrived at the most heart-pounding moment of our story. We're deep into the mystery of Ellen's true identity and the dangerous protection of a man who doesn't know how to love halfway. Are you Team Ellen or Team Dominic? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing your theories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button and join our community of story lovers. We have so much more to uncover. Dominic didn't throw Ellen into a cellar. He didn't interrogate her with the cold efficiency he used on snitches. Instead, he moved her. Not to the guest suite, but into the room directly connected to his, separated only by a set of heavy double-carved oak doors that remained ajar. "You're not a maid anymore, Ellen," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration as he paced the length of the room. He had changed into a dark charcoal gray shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. "You're a ghost. And in this house we protect our ghosts." "I didn't know," Ellen whispered, sitting on the edge of the velvet-tufted bed. She held the locket so tightly the metal bit into her palm. "My father. He told me my mother died in a car accident. He never mentioned a sister. He never mentioned the name Toretto or any connection to this city. I grew up in a town 300 miles away, living in the dirt so we could pay off his gambling debts. I only took this job because I saw the name Castillo on the agency listing and thought it was far enough away from my past." Dominic stopped pacing and looked at her. The resemblance to Letty was haunting. The same high cheekbones, the same defiant spark in the eyes. But where Letty had been fire, Ellen was deep, still water. There was a softness in her that Letty had lost to the streets long ago. "My wife spoke of a sister once," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. "A younger sister, Mia, who was taken by their father after a fire destroyed their home. Letty spent years looking for her. She died thinking she was the only one left." He stepped closer, his presence casting a long shadow over Ellen. "If you are who that locket says you are, you're not just a girl I hired. You're family. And family is everything." But as he looked at her, the word family felt like a lie. The way his heart hammered against his ribs when she looked up at him wasn't brotherly. It was a dark, possessive hunger. He saw the way she bit her lip, the way her pulse fluttered in the hollow of her throat, and he wanted to burn the world down just to keep that pulse steady. The days that followed were a blur of heightened senses and hidden glances. Dominic began to involve Ellen in more than just the nursery. He wanted her at the table during breakfast. He wanted her in his study while he went over shipping manifests, the twins playing on a rug at her feet. He claimed it was for security, but they both knew it was because he couldn't stand to have her out of his sight. The romantic tension became an invisible cord, tightening every time they were in the same room. One evening, while the twins were finally settled, Ellen found Dominic out on the terrace, staring into the dark expanse of the estate's forest. A glass of amber liquid sat untouched on the railing. "You should sleep, Dominic," she said softly, stepping out into the cool night air. He didn't turn around. "Sleep is for people with nothing to lose. Every time I close my eyes, I see Frank's face. I see the fire that took Letty's family. And I see you, walking out that gate." Ellen walked to the railing, standing just far enough away that their shoulders didn't touch, though she could feel the heat radiating off him. "I'm not going anywhere. I have nowhere else to go." "Is that the only reason?" Dominic turned then, his eyes burning with a raw, terrifying honesty. "Because you have no choice?" Ellen felt her breath hitch. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the metallic tang of the city in the distance. "No," she whispered. "It's not." Dominic reached out, his hand hovering over hers on the railing. He didn't touch her, but the proximity made the hair on her arms stand up. "I am a dangerous man, Ellen. My hands are stained. My soul is a graveyard. You should be running as far away from me as possible." "Maybe I'm tired of running," Ellen said, her voice gaining a sudden, bold clarity. She turned her hand over, offering her palm to him. "Maybe I've spent my whole life looking for a wall that wouldn't crumble. You told me you were the walls, Dominic. I believe you." His fingers finally closed over hers. His grip was firm, a silent promise of protection, but his thumb traced the line of her wrist in a way that was anything but protective. It was an invitation. But the moment was shattered by a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of a rifle shot echoing from the perimeter. Dominic reacted with the speed of a coiled spring. He tackled Ellen to the stone floor, his massive body shielding hers as a second shot shattered the glass door of the master suite. "Get down," he roared. The mansion erupted into chaos. Alarms began to blare, a low rhythmic pulse that signaled a code red. Bucky Barnes burst onto the terrace, his weapon drawn. "Boss, they've breached the north gate. It's a full assault." Dominic pulled Ellen up, his eyes darting to the nursery door where the twins were now screaming. "Get the boys. Go to the safe room. Now." "What about you?" Ellen cried, her hands trembling as she scrambled toward the cribs. Dominic grabbed a hidden latch behind a bookshelf, revealing a heavy arsenal. He checked a sleek, black handgun with cold, mechanical precision. "I'm going to remind Frank Costello why no one enters my house without an invitation." He grabbed Ellen's back of the neck, pulling her into a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of adrenaline and salt. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was a claim. A mark. "You are mine. Go," he commanded. As Ellen scooped up the twins and ducked into the reinforced steel corridor of the safe room, she looked back. She saw Dominic standing in the middle of the room, a silhouette of vengeance framed by shattered glass and moonlight. She realized then that the obstacles weren't just the men at the gate or the secrets of her past. The obstacle was the world they lived in. A world where love was a target and peace was just a pause between battles. Inside the safe room, as the heavy door hissed shut, Ellen sat in the dark with the twins, their small hearts racing against her chest. She realized she had left her locket on the nightstand. And she realized something else, something far more terrifying. In the chaos, she had seen one of the attackers through the window. He wasn't wearing Costello's colors. He was wearing a uniform she recognized from her childhood. The men outside weren't just mafia. They were the men her father owed money to. And they weren't here to kill Dominic Toretto. They were here for her. The safe room was a masterpiece of cold engineering, brushed steel walls, flickering monitors, and a silence so absolute it made Ellen's ears ring. Outside, the muffled thud of explosions and the rhythmic chatter of gunfire told the story of a massacre, But inside the only sound was the jagged breathing of the twins. She told me she lost the baby in the fire, Dominic whispered, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. She told me our first child didn't make it. I believed her. I had to believe her to keep going. He took a step toward her, his Aunt Ellen sat on the floor, her back against the reinforced door, clutching Leo and Julian. The monitors showed graining black and white feeds of the mansion's perimeter. She watched as shadows moved through the smoke, men in tactical gear, moving with a precision that didn't match the chaotic brutality of Frank Costello's usual street soldiers. Suddenly, the screen in the center of the console flickered to life. It wasn't a security feed. It was a direct video call, bypassing the mansion's encryption. A face appeared. It was a man Ellen hadn't seen in 3 years, her father, Robert Muldoon. He looked older, his face a roadmap of bad decisions and desperate nights, but his eyes still held that same manipulative shimmer. "Ellen," he whispered through the speaker. "I know you're in there. I know you're holding the Toretto heirs." Ellen's heart skipped a beat. She crawled toward the console, her voice trembling. "Dad? What are you doing? Why are these men attacking the house?" "They aren't my men, Ellen," Robert said, a look of genuine terror crossing his face. "I sold the debt. I had to. I sold it to a man who has been looking for you since the night of the fire 20 years ago. He's not interested in money anymore. He's interested in the truth." "What truth?" Ellen screamed at the screen. "The locket, Ellen. It wasn't a gift. It was a key." Robert leaned closer to his camera, the background behind him looking like a sterile warehouse. "You aren't Letty's sister. You're her daughter." The world seemed to stop spinning. Ellen felt the air leave her lungs. "That's impossible. Letty and Dominic. They didn't have a child before the twins. Everyone knows that." "Dominic doesn't know," Robert hissed. "Letty was pregnant when the fire happened. She thought Dominic was dead. Everyone did for a few months back then. She gave birth in secret, hiding from the enemies who were hunting the Toretto name. She gave you to me, her cousin, to keep you safe, to keep you out of the bloodline. She was going to come for you, but the war never ended. Then the twins came and the world got even darker. She died with that secret because she thought it was the only way you'd ever have a normal life." The monitor hissed with static as a new figure stepped into the frame behind her father. It was Frank Costello. He leaned over Robert's shoulder, a chilling smile on his lips. "So the shy maid is the princess of the empire," Frank whispered. "Imagine Dominic's face when he finds out he's been falling in love with his own daughter's shadow. Or worse, that he let the very person who could destroy his claim to the throne sit at his table." "I don't believe you," Ellen gasped, though in her heart, the pieces were clicking into place with a terrifying mechanical thud. The resemblance, the instinctual bond with the twins, her brothers, and the way Dominic looked at her, searching for a ghost he couldn't quite name. "Believe what you want," Frank said. "But the men outside, they aren't here for the kids. They're here to take you back to the family. Once I have the Toretto heiress, I have the leverage to take every dock, every warehouse, and every drop of blood Dominic owns." The feed cut to black. At that exact moment, the safe room door hissed open. Ellen scrambled back, shielding the twins as a blood-splattered Dominic Toretto stepped inside. He was heaving, his shirt torn, a tactical rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked like he had just climbed out of the depths of hell. "It's clear," he rasped, dropping to one knee to check on the boys. "The perimeter is secure. We held them off." He looked up at Ellen, his eyes softening with that intense, dark heat that had been growing between them. He reached out a hand to touch her hair, to offer the comfort of a lover. "You're safe, Ellen. I promised you." Ellen recoiled as if his hand were a brand. The touch that had once felt like an anchor now felt like a betrayal. If what her father said was true, every look they had shared, every spark of attraction was a sin. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Dominic froze, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Ellen, what happened? Did someone get to the comms?" "My father," she said, standing up on shaky legs, still holding the sleeping infants. He told me who I am, Dominic. He told me about the fire. About Letty." Dominic's expression went from concern to a cold, jagged stone. "What did he tell you? Is it true?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Did Letty have a child before she died? A girl she sent away?" The silence that followed was more violent than the gunfire outside. Dominic's eyes searched hers, and for a fleeting second she saw a flicker of devastating realization. He looked at her cheekbones, the shape of her eyes, the way she held his sons, not as a nurse but as a protector. Trembling. "Ellen, if you are. If I am her daughter," Ellen said, the words tasting like ash, "then everything we felt, every time you looked at me like that, it's a lie. It's a nightmare." Dominic looked at her, the highest stakes of his life suddenly shifting from his empire to the very soul of the woman standing before him. The revelation didn't just challenge his belief in Letty. It shattered the foundation of his growing love for Ellen. "I didn't know," he breathed, the agony in his voice raw and undeniable. "I swear to you I didn't know." But before they could process the horror of the truth, the mansion's internal sensors began to wail. "A secondary breach. They're in the tunnels." Bucky Barnes's voice crackled over the radio. "Boss, they didn't come through the gates. They came up through the old wine cellar. They're heading for the master wing." Dominic grabbed Ellen's arm, his grip no longer a caress but a desperate command. "We have to move. No. If Costello gets his hands on you, he doesn't just get a hostage. He gets the blood of my blood." As they sprinted through the darkened corridors, Ellen looked at the man beside her. He was her protector, her boss, and now potentially the father she never knew, or the man who had unknowingly fallen for his own legacy. The mystery had deepened into a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. And as a grenade detonated in the hallway ahead, separating them by a wall of fire and falling debris, Ellen realized that the darkest hour wasn't coming. It was already here. The explosion was a roar of orange and black that turned the world upside down. The shockwave slammed Ellen against the cold marble of the hallway, the air leaving her lungs in a painful gasp. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard the twins' muffled cries from the protective carrier she'd strapped to her chest. Dust and plaster rained down like gray snow. "Dominic!" she screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of crumbling stone. Across the divide of fallen mahogany beams and jagged drywall, she saw him. Dominic was on his feet, but a wall of fire, fed by a ruptured gas line, raged between them. His face was a mask of soot and blood, his eyes wide with a desperate feral terror she had never seen in him. "Ellen! Stay there!" he roared, coughing against the thick acrid smoke. He began to heave a massive piece of debris aside, his muscles straining until the veins in his neck looked ready to burst. "I'm coming for you." But the shadows behind Ellen moved faster. Before she could scramble toward him, a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. The scent of chemicals, chloroform, hit her nose. She fought, kicking and clawing, but the grip was like iron. As her vision began to fray at the edges, she saw the silhouette of Frank Costello stepping through the smoke of the secondary breach. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at her with the hungry gaze of a man who had finally found the golden ticket. "The king is trapped in his burning castle," Frank's voice echoed, sounding hollow and distorted. "And the princess is coming with me." "No." Dominic's scream was the last thing Ellen heard before the world dissolved into a sickening velvet black. When Ellen woke, the silence was more terrifying than the explosions. She was tied to a heavy wooden chair in what looked like a derelict boathouse. The air was damp, smelling of salt and rotting timber. Through a cracked window she could see the gray, churning waters of the harbor. Her head throbbed and her chest felt light, too light. Her heart stopped. "The babies. Where are they?" she rasped, her voice a broken whisper. "Where are the boys?" "Relax, princess," a voice came from the shadows. Frank Costello stepped into the light, twirling his wolf-headed cane. "The Toretto heirs are in a separate room, being fed by a woman who actually has a nursing degree. I'm not a monster. Dead hostages have no value." "You won't get away with this," Ellen spit, her eyes burning with a defiance that would have made Letty proud. "Dominic will kill you. He will tear this city apart until there's nothing left of you but a memory." "Dominic is currently occupied with a funeral," Frank said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from her. He leaned in close. "You see, everyone thinks you died in that fire. My men left a body in the rubble, a girl about your size taken from the morgue. As far as the Black King knows, he just lost his sons and the daughter he only just realized he had." The cruelty of it hit Ellen like a physical blow. Dominic, sitting in the ruins of his home, believing he had failed everyone he loved. The thought of his grief, that raw, jagged pain she had seen on the first night, now magnified 1,000 times, broke her heart more than the ropes cutting into her wrists. "Why?" she whispered. "If you want the Empire, just take it. Why torture him?" "Because power isn't about territory, Ellen. It's about breaking the will of the man who holds it," Frank sneered. "And once I force you to sign these documents, confessing your rightful claim to the Toretto holdings and appointing me as your conservator, Dominic won't have an empire to fight for. He'll be a broken man with a legacy of ashes." He stood up, signaling to a man by the door, Arthur Shelby, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Keep her hydrated. I want her conscious when she signs the end of the Toretto line." As they left, Ellen slumped in her chair. She was alone. She was the shy maid again, trapped in a nightmare where she was nothing but a pawn. She thought of her father who had sold her out. She thought of Letty who had died to keep her secret. And she thought of Dominic. She remembered the way his forehead had rested against hers in the garden. She remembered the heat of his hand and the promise in his voice. "I am the walls." But the walls had fallen. For the next several hours, Ellen descended into her own personal dark night. She felt the weight of the secrets she carried. The impossible reality that the man she had begun to love might be her father. The thought made her stomach churn with a complex, agonizing grief. If they survived this, there was no happily ever after. There was only a lifetime of looking at him and seeing the tragedy of what they could never be. She looked at the ropes. She looked at the rusted nail protruding from the floorboards just inches from her feet. "I am not just a maid," she told herself, the words a mantra against the despair. "I am the daughter of Letty and Dominic. I am a Toretto." She began to scoot her chair, inch by agonizing inch, toward the nail. The wood groaned. The salt spray from the window chilled her skin. She was exhausted, terrified, and grieving a life she hadn't even fully understood. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Thunder shook the boathouse, and for a moment the sound mimicked the crying of infants. "I'm coming for you, Leo," she whispered into the dark. "I'm coming for you, Julian." But as she reached the nail and began to saw the ropes against the metal, the door creaked open. It wasn't Frank. It was a man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured. He held a silenced pistol in one hand and a small gold locket in the other. He walked toward her with a terrifying, silent purpose. Ellen froze. Was this the end? Was this the cleaner, sent to finish what the fire couldn't? The man reached out and pulled back his hood. It wasn't an enemy. It was Bucky Barnes, Dominic's most loyal lieutenant. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "The boss sent me," he whispered, his voice shaking. "He's gone rogue, Ellen. He's burning the city down to find you. He doesn't believe you're dead. He says he can still feel your pulse." "Bucky," Ellen gasped, her heart leaping. "The babies. They're in the next room." "I know," Bucky said, cutting her bonds with a tactical knife. "But we have a problem. Costello has the place rigged. If we move you, the whole pier goes up. And Dominic is already at the gate. He's coming in hot, and he has no idea he's walking into a trap." The darkest hour had just become a countdown. The boathouse groaned under the assault of the storm, the wood shrieking like a living thing. Bucky Barnes was already moving toward the door, his movements clinical and cold, but Ellen stayed rooted to the floor for a heartbeat, her mind racing faster than the rhythmic ticking of the explosives Frank had hidden in the pilings. "Ellen, we have 3 minutes, Bucky urged, checking his tactical watch. "The boss is hitting the front perimeter with everything he has. He's using himself as a distraction so I can get you and the boys out, but he doesn't know about the pressure triggers." Ellen looked at the door leading to the adjacent room where she could hear a faint, rhythmic whimpering. Her brothers. Her blood. "He's going to die for a lie, Bucky," Ellen said, her voice dropping the shy maid persona entirely. The fear was still there, but it had been forged into something sharper. A weapon. "He thinks he's saving a maid or a daughter he just found. He doesn't realize he's walking into a graveyard." "He doesn't care," Bucky replied, handing her a compact 9mm pistol. "To him there's no difference. Now move." They burst into the side room. Arthur Shelby was there, sitting by the dual cribs, his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't reach for his gun. He looked at Ellen, really looked at her, and the resemblance to Letty seemed to break the last of his resolve. "The detonator is with Frank," Arthur rasped, his voice thick with guilt. He's on the upper catwalk. He's waiting for Dominic to reach the center of the pier. Ellen. I didn't know he was going to rig the place with the kids inside. I'm a soldier, not a child killer. Then help us, Ellen commanded. It wasn't a request. As Bucky scooped up the twins, securing them into a reinforced tactical carrier, Ellen didn't head for the exit. She headed for the stairs. Ellen. What are you doing? Bucky hissed. Dominic is the walls, remember? Ellen called back over her shoulder, her feet flying up the rusted metal steps. But even walls need a foundation. I'm going to take the detonator. At that moment, the front doors of the boathouse exploded inward. A black SUV roared through the entrance, with splinters flying like shrapnel. Dominic Toretto emerged from the driver's side before the vehicle had even stopped rolling. He was a vision of absolute carnage. His shirt gone, replaced by a tactical vest, his skin caked in the dust of the mansion he had watched burn. He moved with a terrifying singular focus toward the center of the room. Costello. Dominic's roar drowned out the thunder. Show your face. High above, on the narrow steel catwalk, Frank Costello stepped into the light of a flickering halogen bulb. He held a small black remote in his hand. You're late, Dominic, Frank shouted down, his voice dripping with malice. But just in time for the fireworks. You want your legacy? It's right under your feet. All it takes is one thumb press and the Toretto name is erased from history. Dominic stopped. He saw the twins with Bucky near the exit. He saw the wires snaking through the floorboards. And then his eyes traveled up. He saw Ellen. She was standing on the opposite end of the catwalk, hidden in the shadows behind Frank. She looked at Dominic, and in that split second, a silent conversation passed between them, a connection that defied the trauma of the night and the confusion of her birthright. Wait, her eyes pleaded. I have you, his gaze promised. You think a remote makes you a king, Frank? Dominic said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, drawing Frank's attention away from the shadows. A king protects his own. You're just a scavenger picking at the bones of a better man's life. Better man. Frank laughed, his thumb hovering over the red button. You let your wife die. You let your daughter grow up in the dirt. You're a failure, Toretto. And now you're a ghost. Not yet, a voice whispered from the dark. Ellen lunged. She didn't use the gun. She knew Frank was fast enough to press the button if he saw a barrel. Instead, she used the weight of her entire body, slamming into his back. The remote skittered across the metal grating, sliding toward the edge of the catwalk. Frank roared, spinning around and backhanding Ellen with the heavy silver head of his cane. She hit the railing, the world spinning, blood blooming in her mouth. You little brat. Frank lunged for the remote. But the distraction was all Dominic needed. He was no longer a man, he was a force of nature. He vaulted over a crate, scaled the ladder in seconds and met Frank in the middle of the catwalk. The first punch Dominic landed sounded like a mallet hitting a side of beef. The remote teetered on the very edge of the steel grating, 30 feet above the concrete floor. Ellen scrambled on her hands and knees, her fingers clawing at the cold metal. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the plastic casing of the detonator just as Frank's boot came down on her wrist. She screamed, but she didn't let go. Dominic, she cried out. Dominic didn't look at the remote. He looked at her. He saw the pain in her face, and it triggered a level of protective rage that surpassed anything he had ever felt. He grabbed Frank by the throat, lifted the man off his feet and held him over the railing. The button, Dominic. Frank wheezed, clutching at Dominic's massive arms. If it falls, we all go. Then we go together, Dominic growled. But Ellen had the remote. She had pulled it back from the edge, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on the man who might be her father. The man who was willing to die to ensure she lived. It's over, Frank, Ellen said, her voice steady despite the blood on her lips. She held the remote up, her thumb over the disarm sequence Bucky had whispered to her earlier. The turning point wasn't just the physical victory. It was the moment Ellen realized she wasn't a victim of her lineage or her past. She was the one holding the power. She looked at Dominic, not as a ghost of Letty, not as a maid, but as a Toretto. Bucky, get them out. Ellen yelled. As the disarm light turned green, the tension that had held the room together snapped. Dominic threw Frank backward onto the catwalk, where Arthur Shelby was waiting with zip ties and a look of grim redemption. Dominic turned to Ellen. He didn't move toward her with the hunger of a lover or the distance of a stranger. He walked to her and simply pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. "I thought I lost you twice," he whispered into her hair. "Never again." The storm outside began to break, the first hints of a pale, watery dawn peeking through the clouds. They were alive. The twins were safe. But as they stood there, the weight of the daughter revelation remained, a final puzzle piece that hadn't quite settled into place. "Dominic," Ellen whispered, pulling back to look at him. "The things Frank said, about the fire, about me. We'll find the truth," Dominic promised, his hand cupping her face. "Together. But first we go home." The adrenaline that had sustained them through the explosion and the siege began to ebb, replaced by a raw, aching clarity. The boathouse was now swarming with Dominic's most trusted men, but the world felt small, reduced to the space between Dominic and Ellen. Frank Costello was being dragged away, his face a mask of bruised ego and shattered plans. But as he passed the pair, he let out a jagged, rattling laugh. "You think you've won, Toretto? You're holding a girl who represents your greatest failure. Every time you look at her, you'll see the lie Letty told you. You'll see a daughter you never wanted." Dominic's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but he didn't give Frank the satisfaction of a response. He kept his arm around Ellen, anchored to her reality. "Bucky, get the boys to the secondary safe house." "I'll meet you there," Dominic commanded, his voice returning to its ironclad authority. He turned to Ellen, his eyes searching hers. "There's one more person we need to see. Someone who has been hiding in the shadows of this story for 20 years. They drove in silence to a small, nondescript cottage on the outskirts of the city, shielded by ancient oaks. Inside, an elderly woman sat by a fireplace, her hands gnarled by time but her eyes sharp as a hawk's. This was Clara Oswald, the midwife who had attended Letty during the months following the fire. Dominic placed the gold locket on the table between them. "The truth, Claire. No more ghosts. No more riddles. Is Ellen my daughter?" Clara looked at the locket, then at Ellen, a sad smile touching her lips. "Letty came to me in terror, Dominic. She thought you were dead and she knew your enemies would use a child to bait you even beyond the grave. He did have a daughter. She named her Mia after your sister." Ellen felt the world tilt. The Mia, her father, Robert, had mentioned, was real. "But," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the fire that night, it didn't just take your home. It took the light from Letty's world for a long time. The baby she gave to Robert Muldoon, that baby was a decoy." Dominic froze. "A decoy? Letty was many things, but she was never a fool," Clara said, leaning forward. "She knew Robert was a gambler. She knew he couldn't be trusted with a Toretto heir. She gave him a locket and a child she had rescued from the same fire, an orphan whose parents had perished. She used that child to draw the heat away from the real Mia." Ellen's breath hitched. "Then, who am I?" Clara reached into a hidden drawer and pulled out a weathered handwritten letter. "You were the orphan, Ellen. Letty saved your life. She loved you as her own for those first few months, but she knew she couldn't keep you. She gave you to Robert because she knew his greed would keep you alive. She wanted you to have a life away from the blood and the bullets. She sacrificed her relationship with you to give you a chance at being normal." Clara then turned to Dominic. "Your real daughter, the true Mia, was sent to a convent in the north, protected by a different name entirely. He's safe. She's a teacher now. She has no idea of the empire her father built." The silence in the room was absolute. The forbidden wall between Dominic and Ellen didn't just crumble, it vanished. Ellen wasn't his daughter. She was the girl his wife had died to save. She was the first life Letty had protected before she ever had the twins. The bond Ellen felt with Leo and Julian wasn't just blood. It was the echoes of a woman who had taught Ellen how to love before she could even remember it. Dominic looked at Ellen, and the grief that had haunted him for months finally seemed to lift. The shy maid wasn't a ghost of his past. He was a gift from it. "She saved you," Dominic whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Letty saved you for me." "And you saved me tonight," Ellen replied, her eyes brimming with tears. The final twist wasn't a betrayal, it was a homecoming. The mystery of the locket was solved. The shy maid was a Toretto by choice and by history if not by blood. Dominic stood up and walked toward her. This time when he reached for her there was no hesitation. No fear of a sin. He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off the ground. "I don't care about the bloodline," he murmured against her temple. "I care about the woman who walked into a room of screaming children and brought peace to a dead man's heart." They stepped out of the cottage and into the full light of a new day. The empire was still there, dangerous, bloody, and demanding, but the foundation was no longer made of secrets. The morning sun didn't just rise. It conquered the sky, burning away the last of the storm's gray remnants. 6 months had passed since the night the boathouse nearly became a tomb and the Castillo mansion, once a cold fortress of shadows, had been transformed. The scent of wood smoke and expensive bourbon had been replaced by the aroma of fresh jasmine and the soft, bubbling laughter of 2 thriving toddlers. If you've stayed with us until the end of this journey, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story of a man who found his soul and a woman who found her strength is one that stays with you. Which moment moved you the most? Was it the first time the crying stopped or the revelation in the cottage? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to become a permanent part of our storytelling family. Your support means the world to us. The scars on the mansion's walls had been repaired, but the changes within were more profound. Ellen Ripley no longer wore a starch-white apron or kept her head bowed to the floor. She moved through the halls with the quiet, unshakable grace of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. She wasn't the shy maid anymore. She was the heartbeat of the Toretto home. In the sun-drenched nursery, Leo and Julian were no longer the fragile, red-faced infants of a grieving house. They were sturdy, happy boys, currently occupied with trying to climb the sturdy legs of Bucky Barnes, who had traded his tactical rifle for a wooden block set. The guards still paced the perimeter, but the atmosphere had shifted from one of paranoia to one of fierce, protective peace. Dominic Toretto stood on the terrace watching his sons. He looked different. The jagged edge of his grief had been smoothed over, replaced by a deep, resonant contentment. He still ruled his empire with an iron fist, but the fist was now guided by a heart that had been brought back to life. Ellen stepped out onto the terrace, a tray of coffee in her hands. She wore a simple, elegant dress, the gold locket still resting against her collarbone, no longer a mystery but a badge of honor. "They're asking for you," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Julian thinks he can win a wrestling match against Bucky." Dominic turned, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his face. He reached out, pulling Ellen into the curve of his arm. "Bucky's in trouble then. Those boys have their mother's spirit." He looked at her, his gaze lingering on her eyes. The truth they had uncovered at the cottage hadn't distanced them, it had cemented them. They were bound by a legacy of sacrifice and a future of their own making. "I heard from the convent today," Dominic said softly. "The real Mia, she's doing well. I've set up a trust for her school anonymously. She'll never want for anything." "You did the right thing," Ellen whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Letty would be proud of the man you've become for all of them." "I only became that man because you walked through that door," Dominic replied. He turned her to face him, his hands, the same hands that had once known only violence, cupping her face with a tenderness that still made her breath hitch. "You saved us, Ellen. You didn't just stop the crying. You started the life." He leaned down, kissing her with a slow, deep passion that spoke of 1,000 tomorrows. It was a kiss that held the promise of safety, the heat of a hard-earned love, and the quiet joy of a family finally made whole. As the boys' laughter drifted out from the nursery, joined by the rhythmic thump-thump of a house finally at rest, the story of the Mafia Boss and the Maid reached its true resolution. There were no more ghosts in the hallways. There were no more secrets in the shadows. Ellen Ripley had arrived at the mansion looking for a place to hide. Instead, she had found a place to lead. She had found a father for the fatherless parts of her soul, brothers to protect, and a man who looked at her as if she were the only miracle in a world of stone. The silence in the Castillo mansion was finally, beautifully peaceful. Did you enjoy this story? Let me know what you think in the comments section. If you want more of these stories, ensure you click the like and subscribe button. I am Annabelle, see you on the next one.